Power, water, telecoms, the systems that keep a country running. Melissa exposed every one of them. So what comes next? The National Resilience Dialogue Series, 7 national conversations. Evidence, policy, action. Event 2, Utilities and Critical Systems, powering recovery, restoring the networks Jamaica relies on and asking how we rebuild them stronger. Convened by the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience. Thursday, May 21, 2026, 4 o'clock, live on these channels. See you there. This is the National Resilience Dialogue Series, a national conversation on how Jamaica rebuilds stronger. From the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience. And now, your host, Dion Jackson Miller.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here. This is the second in the National Dialogue Series. The first one, we had a really great discussion on housing, on rebuilding infrastructure. Make sure you check out that. You can catch it on the YouTube page as well. And today we're going to be talking about shedding light. See what I did there? On one of the most important issues after natural disaster. How do we switch back on the utilities? How do we do it faster? How do we do it more efficiently? How do we do it, of course, safely? And as well, I just want to introduce our guests for this panel. We have with us Dr. Peter Clark. He's a professional engineer in environmental engineering. He's also managing director of the Water Resources Authority. We have with us as well Ricardo Case. He's senior vice president at JPS for shared services. He's successfully led major initiatives in engineering and systems operations, and of course, a big one, emergency restoration. With us as well, Stephen Murad. He has years of experience in telecoms in the United Kingdom. He now brings that to us as a CEO of Digicel Jamaica. And Dr. Devon Gardner is a regional energy policy leader. He's an expert in renewable energies and development. He's founding partner at the Institute of Innovation and Growth. He's also president at Sunterra Energy in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Look, this is no longer an academic discussion. If it ever were, those of us in the Caribbean know that for decades we have seen our utilities suffer after major disasters. As somebody who went without light for 4 months after Hurricane Gilbert, yes, back in the day, I know that for sure. And 2025, we saw Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica, Cat 5 hurricane, something we had never seen before, and parts of Jamaica went dark. Lights went, water went, telecoms went. People didn't have phone, and we all know the kind of distress that caused. So we're looking forward to this conversation today. What happened, what has happened since, and what still needs to happen. All right, and let me start out by asking our guests to give us just a couple minutes to set the context for us and tell us what happened in their particular sector after Hurricane Melissa hit. Dr. Clark, let me start with you.
Recording in progress.
Well, thank you, Dion, and greetings to my fellow panelists and all the listeners and guests online. Well, as you know, first of all, I represent the Water Resources Authority, which is not a utility, different water utility and companies, not just for potable water, but also for irrigation water. So essentially what would have happened was that a lot of the systems went down for especially, I can tell you about our National Water Commission, which is the state-run organization. There are other players as well who also produce water and deliver water. But water in Jamaica is sourced from 2 primary areas, either springs and rivers or underground from wells. In either case, they would have been impacted severely wherever a hurricane would have passed. For the rivers would have been in spate. They would have had high turbidity, carrying a lot of silt and sand, and as a result, they would not be immediately usable. Added to that is the fact that the rivers, some of those systems that are taking waters from rivers and springs have to be pumped. And then if the power goes down, that becomes another issue for them. With regard to well sources, all our well sources, the water is pumped up from the wells. So there is demand for constant electricity for those systems to operate. And when the grid goes down, when the electricity grid goes down, then even if the water quality has not been compromised, the production is compromised because those wells depend and pumps depend on electricity to run. Additionally, we had the situation of flooding in a number of areas where the Water Resources Authority would have been quite would have been there to have a lot to say about that. We had communities that had not been flooded for a very long time. We had communities that, and we're not necessarily talking about river flooding or river, what we call riverine flooding. We're talking about situations in communities where groundwater would have essentially erupted from the ground and created flooding in depression areas. Some of those areas were areas that are known traditionally to flood. Let us say a new market, for instance, or even Chigwell in Hanover. Content, on the other hand, which was quite topical at the time, that had not flooded in quite a few years, and so that no had not been expected by, especially by the residents that were there. So that became a
Okay, I think we're having.
the important thing that we must know.
All right, Dr. Clark, let me ask you to hold on. Let me ask Dr. Clark to hold on. We're having a little bit of interruption with him. And
with our rivers and the 90% water, it's now carrying, let's say, 80% silt instead.
Okay. All right, thanks so much for that. And it's interesting the way you describe it, because what we're hearing there is that we didn't have water where we wanted it, which is in our pipes, and there was water where we didn't want it in terms of the flooding in the communities you speak of. And it's a natural segue to Rick Case at JPS, because I know JPS is at the center, in fact, of a lot of the utilities in terms of their dependence and their interdependence. So let me ask you, Mr. Case, in terms of what happened and where are we now?
All right, thank you. And thank you to the Higher Education Task Force. I definitely want to start off by thanking the people of Jamaica. They have been very patient and gracious with us. We understand at JPS that Jamaica needs electricity to restart. And we take that very seriously in terms of our preparation. We're very intentional about it. So in terms of what actually happened, we were faced with an unprecedented hurricane. You started off by saying that in the introduction. Never before have we seen a storm like this. Typically for hurricanes of this intensity, our normal procedures would be to shut the grid down. We have a bold new CEO, and he challenged us to, I would want to say, fight Melissa. The team at our System Operations Center pretty much stood for almost 18 hours, which was about the time it took for Melissa to make up her mind to cross Jamaica and to enter at St. Elizabeth and leave in Trelawney. So they actually fought the hurricane right through, doing all kinds of innovations on the power network, splitting the island into what we call 2 electrical islands, and pretty much 1 electrical island survived when the hurricane passed. So we had at the end, when Melissa passed, we had about 23% of our customers with power. 77% of the island was without power. And outside of Kingston and parts of St. Andrew, everybody was without power. 1 month after, we would have restored about 80% of our customers. And right now we're at day 201. Yes, we are still restoring customers now. This morning we had just about 76 customers out of power, with about 74 of those customers in Westmoreland and 2 customers remaining to be restored in St. Elizabeth. And I think by the end of today or by early tomorrow, we should wrap that up. We are having a whole lot of challenges in what we call the last mile now, which is really doing a whole lot of work to pick up a small number of customers. So in terms of the scale and the magnitude of Melissa's wrath on us, we had over, for example, 40,000 of our poles that were damaged during Melissa. And on a scale compared to, say, Beryl, we had just about 8,000 poles that were damaged. So when you look at just the magnitude of Melissa to Beryl and the path that it actually took, we had much more devastation. Our transmission system, which is the backbone of our grid, we had very little damage, if any, during Beryl. For Melissa, we almost 81% of our transmission lines had a fault or went out due to the winds, the strong winds, over 185 miles per hour. We even had the steel towers, which is the strongest class of hardware that we have on our transmission system, being crumpled and I would say like foil paper. That's the best way to describe it. Persons who would have lived through the storm described it to us as having a kind of cyclonic effect. So it was like a hurricane plus a tornado in one swoop, right? So very, very little, if anything, could have survived the wrath of Melissa. So just to jump quickly in terms of what we're actually doing different, we're actually putting in more resilient design. So typically for us,
hold on to that. I'm going to come back to that. Very interested in that, but let me just finish going around the room. But sorry, just 2 points. One, just for accuracy, just that Melissa actually entered at New Hope in Westmoreland. Although I know we saw the pictures of Black River, so we must have thought that's where it entered, but it was New Hope in Westmoreland. And just quickly, could you just comment just before I go to the others, Rick, on how it is that JPS going down affects NWC, affects telecoms?
All right, so most of those facilities, they are directly powered from the grid. So, so two things might affect the telecoms. One, they actually share some of our infrastructure in terms of running their wires along our poles, so that can affect the telecoms as well. But typically, once they lose power, then after a certain period of time, their backup power will be depleted, and then their systems will go down. The Water Commission is directly fed based on the size of their plants. They are directly fed from JPS. So without power, their pumps will not work.
Okay, and that's a great segue now to Stephen Morad of Digicel, because again, people couldn't phone nobody. Phones were down. Mr. Morad, tell us in terms of the scale of the impact.
Thanks, Dion, and thanks for the intro before. Certainly my time in the UK did never prepare me for any hurricane at all. We are definitely devoid of hurricanes, but my 11 years in the Caribbean definitely prepared me, and being in the region for so long, I've been through quite a lot of these, definitely, either here in Jamaica, Bermuda, Turks and Caicos, Dominica. We've been ravaged over the years, definitely, and I think that's part of how we're able to recover quickly as a group. So we are pretty well versed on that, because you just don't know what the impact is until day one. Until you go and assess, you've actually no idea really what you're gonna hit. So what happened, Dion? So we were about 70% of the mobile network. So that's over 600, it's maybe 650 sites of the 925 were off air. 43 of those were severely damaged, so i.e. they needed fixing, rebuilding from scratch, so there's a variation between small fixes to complete rebuilds as well, so you got to think of it in that way. Radio networks, when you look at a tower, you have antennas on the tower. They're the LTE antennas that power up your mobile phone and allows you to use data. We also have the 3G radios, which allows you to use voice as well. You got a mixture of completely damaged, blown off, or moved out of alignment. So you imagine an antenna and its vector, it's pointing this way for a reason, and that's moved in the wind. So all of a sudden it's not operating as it should be. But I'll just touch on, because Rick gave me a good segue. So today, we rely on the commercial grid for powering our 925 sites. That is an absolute must for us as well. So continuity of power is critical. What we have for emergency measures or interim disruptions, because there could be, Rick's team, Blaine and the guys might be doing planned works, those things happen all of the time in Jamaica. So we have generators and batteries. Batteries tend to give us about up to 6 hours of where we can keep the service going on the site assuming all things are equal and the antennas are still on the site and the site is still up. Generators, we tend to run 3 to 4 days before it needs to be refueled. Beryl taught us if we didn't have Beryl, we would have not recovered as quick in Melissa. And that enabled us to work out how to do mass fuel distribution. So Rick talked about the 2 islands that they did, and I think they learned this from Beryl, if memory serves me right, Rick, as well, when you split the country. We split it into 5 segments to enable us to refuel those sites quicker. Think about some of our sites, Dion. They're up mountains, they're in hills, they're in very remote areas, not easy to get to. So having smaller fuel hubs, sometimes with jerry cans, we have to quad bikes, motorbikes to get up to those sites to put fuel into those towers. So where we learned from Beryl is how to do that, and that enabled us. So all of those things that's the mobile network. Rick touched on the poles. So we predominantly use the poles for the transport network, which is the distribution network, the fiber, if I may, and that's either fiber to power the mobile site or fiber to somebody's home or a business as well. So obviously if the pole goes down, the fiber is probably most likely going to get damaged as well. So we would have seen a lot of damage on that side of the business. So mobile network about 70% off. On the fixed side, the fiber customers, about 40% of those customers offline. And it took us a rough number down to about 3 months to get all of the mobile network to enable us to service 100% of our customers again. And I use the term, and maybe we can touch on the what next in the next part of the segment, but it was about getting some semblance of service working, not how it was before the 28th of October. So we would have used untraditional methods for us, which is non-core, which would be utilizing satellite technology on the mobile towers to provide some service. That's it won't provide the service that they used to on their LTE network. That it doesn't have the same kind of capacity and throughput. So people's behavior on Netflix or TikTok that they're used to using on their phone, and they want to just carry on doing it in the same way, they're not going to get the same experience. But in an emergency situation, we have to make strategic decisions. We have to provide technology. So we use satellite, and we also used a technology we've used for some time, which is microwave, which relies on line of sight to bounce around the sites to provide the same kind of transport network. But I think that the main damage for us really is when the poles are down. That's a significant challenge, and I know we'll talk about the what next and maybe in the next segment, so I can touch on that. But certainly immediate damage. So roughly 3 months to get the mobile network operating. I reiterate, if the guys hadn't to learn so much from Beryl, we'd have not recovered that network so quickly in that 3 months time. So hopefully that gives you an opening semblance of the what.
Yes, certainly gives us some great context. And let me bring in Dr. Gardner now, because you're not responsible for utilities, Dr. Gardner, but as a renewable energy expert, you have expertise in an area a lot of people started to look to, because people started to say, hold on, maybe more of us need to put in the solar, how much for a solar battery? Can solar batteries replace JPS? Can we get rid of all these utilities? Tell us what Hurricane Melissa showed us or told us about renewables and where we are with it. You're on mute.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that for that segue. And the colleagues have given us quite a lot of insight into what would have happened with the utilities. So I'm not going to go over the things that they had discussed, but rather I want to point out the fact that we are currently in the world, and the Caribbean has joined the initiative, shifting. We're trying to shift to greater amounts of renewable energy use last week and for a while because of the transmission lines that were down. So we need to understand from the utility side how it is that we account for the risks, the increased risks that are related to power generators that are weather dependent and at the same time allowing us to become more exposed to these kind of extreme weather events like hurricanes. One of the things I had worked on when I was at the CARICOM headquarters and at the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency was something called Integrated Resource and Resilience Planning. And what that would look at was how it is that we already look at the vulnerability of the renewable resources itself and the renewable infrastructure, and how we would have built into those infrastructure some amount of fail-safe, some amount of hardening. Of course, you can't totally build fail-safe and hardening into the system, because then that becomes too expensive and consumers would not be able to afford that electricity. But being able to figure out how to optimize the infrastructure together with the operational requirement that will give you the kind of redundancies that will allow you to get the best performance in the face of the threats that that come with us being in a hurricane belt is something that we need to do a lot more work on. JPS, of course, had worked with us at the time on understanding what the vulnerability of the system is. And those are some of the things that we have been doing. One of the things that we ensure we do, especially when it comes on to solar these days, is we are building in mechanisms to improve how the solar will perform in winds. Of course, when you get to a hurricane, category 5 hurricane like Melissa is, there's almost nothing you can do if it passes directly over where the solar facility is located. But we are trying to, of course, account for lower category hurricanes that will happen frequently too. So with reducing the tilt of the angles from 20 degrees to 10 degrees, really you lose some amount of the production, because 20 degrees is usually optimal for production, but 10 degrees reduces the wind load and the solar panels when you tilt them at a lower angle. And so you try to balance what would be optimal production versus what would be improved performance in the event that you have a storm or a hurricane. And these are some of the things that you're doing. We have put in place, there are certain standards now that looks at how you bolt and install racking system and how panels are installed, and to reduce what some of the issues that came about in the earlier days. We have seen where in Puerto Rico, in St. Thomas, USVI, where hurricanes would have destroyed many solar farms, and we learned from those cases, and we have tried to improve the standards. Now, to shift to the side where you spoke.
That point for me, Dr. Gardner, because I want to come back to some of that, but let me just shift gear a little bit and go back around the room. We've seen the release of the 2026 hurricane forecast. Now, I think everybody in Jamaica now probably gets triggered when they think about June 1 and the start of a new hurricane season. We're hearing from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that as a result of El Nino, they're expecting a reduced hurricane season in terms of frequency and strength, but they're predicting still 8 to 14 named storms, 3 to 6 predicted to become hurricanes, 1 to 3 major hurricanes, meaning category 3, 4, or 5. And as we know, it only takes one. So where it reduces our risk, it certainly doesn't eliminate it, and I don't think it really calms anybody's fears, which leads us to the next segment and the next question, which is what have we done to get ourselves ready now for this June 1 in particular? And I'll start with JPS and Rickes.
All right, thank you, Dion. So one of the things that we're doing is quickly apply the lessons learned from Melissa. So all of what worked well for Melissa's response, we're actually going to be doing that, of course, enhanced by what didn't work so well and what we could do differently. So that exercise has started. We've deployed quite a bit of technology, but as far as resilience is concerned, some of the things that we have actually introduced now includes more on the grid hardening aspect of things. So, for example, we are using an expanded foam technology now, where instead of using just a normal backfill when we plant our poles, we're now using a kind of a chemical that hardens like a concrete. And what this actually does is to prevent the uplift of the poles when they are subjected to heavy winds. We're also using, I guess you'd say, more dense poles or higher class poles where poles were before. So during the restoration now, for example, we had a class 4 pole. We actually would have been replacing that now with a class 2 pole, which is a more dense and stronger, more resilient pole in the same place. We've also, for example, redesigned our network. So one of the things that Melissa actually forced us to do was to do a rebuild in certain areas. So certain terrains where the circuit were, we actually moved them to areas which is more accessible and easier for us to service. But also in the redesign as well, we shortened the span length between the poles. So that actually reduces the mechanical swing when winds actually catch the conductors, and those things normally cause bending and breaking forces on the pole. So we have actually shortened the pole spans, right? And then we do have some circuits that are actually out as well. So we're actually using a different type of pole now instead of wood poles. We're actually, for those circuits that are out in those areas that we cannot actually relocate, we're actually using even higher class poles going up to H4, H5 poles, but we're actually using composite poles. So composite poles is a kind of hardened plastic, close to fiberglass type poles, which can actually deal more accommodating of the higher winds, but they do not break, right? So quite a few things that we're actually doing on the resilience aspect of things as we actually build out the network. As it relates to our inventory, so nothing beats the inventory, right? So we basically have developed strategic partnerships through CARILEC, and CARILEC is the Caribbean Electric Utility Group, as well as some of our other partners now, to have our stock levels bumped up back. So I did mention at the start that we're actually still doing restoration. We would have significantly depleted quite a bit of our stock. So we do have some stock that is not where it is yet going into the season, but we have some arrangements now that's going to get us to the stock level and even above, so that by the time the hurricane comes, or let's, God forbid it shouldn't come, but we should be ready there. And then finally now, in terms of our contract arrangements with external support, one of the things that Melissa taught us is that we cannot do it alone. We would have exhausted all the resources on the island of Jamaica, every single contractor, everybody was at work, but that still would have limited us in terms of the pace of restoration, right? We know that Jamaicans want power as fast as possible and they don't care. So we have some contracts in place for mutual aid to have persons in. We did it during Melissa, but we still have some of those contracts now will allow us to get persons in before the storm, so that immediately as the storm passes, we can hit, press the go button and get going. So I would probably pause there, Dan, and allow the others to. Dan? Dan frozen?
I'm hearing you, Rick.
Okay.
I think so.
All right.
Okay.
Peter,
do you want to go next, just and we can keep the show going?
Yeah, well, I don't know if we're on, but with regard to water supply systems, one of the things that happened or will happen is that, especially if you have water supply that is sourced directly from rivers, what we call a run-of-the-river intake, that structure is actually in the river. So the Great River, for instance, that provides a lot of the water for a source for Montego Bay and its environs, parts of St. James. The actual takeoff is a concrete structure in the river. Now these will silt over rapidly when the river is carrying a lot of sediment. And the other thing is that in those areas, some amount of the transmission pipeline, the raw water pipeline that's going to treatment, has to follow the river course. So that would have been a problem that would have that is a problem that happened with regard to Melissa and, for instance, the Great River water supply. So the pipeline was disrupted. The good thing is that there's pipe, the companies keep pipe, the Water Commission keep pipe on stock. And so they were able to pull from stock and get the pipelines repaired in double quick time, and also to get the intake cleared. For instance, the Martha Brae now is pulling as a pump from the river, so that doesn't get affected so much by sediment, but the The ones where the run of the river intake those are a lot more vulnerable to high sedimentation and silting in terms of the actual facility being down or out of commission for some time. The Yellow pipeline also is a run of the river intake. Now, the water commission, for instance, now one of the other things that they had to do was they had to get in large standby generators, double quick time as well, because of the uncertainty of when the JPS power would have come up, Stephen. And so they were able to put standby generators at critical plants so that they were able to get water out. So one of the early utilities that was up, back, and running, not necessarily limping along, but really running, would have been the water supply, because the stock was there to repair broken pipelines, and they were able to get generators to sites and have those generators operating in the meantime. Now those generators are now in storage. They are now in storage so that if, God forbid, you need them again, they're available. Another thing that happened right after Melissa was that there were quite a few institutions that had small portable water treatment plants. So it was just fortuitous, for instance, that Food for the Poor had 3 or 4 small water treatment plants that they could mobilize by truck into an area once there was a water source. So they were able to augment a lot of the locations some of the locations that would have lost water. They were able to augment that with a portable plant. Isratec also had portable water plants, and they also mobilized theirs. And there were others. There was World Water, WaterWise, and so on, and a number of other institutions that were on hand with portable plants or very close to bringing it, easy to bring it to Jamaica. They came in, standby plants came in early. As the Water Resources Authority, who have to manage the abstraction of water, we recognize the importance, we recognize the emergency. And so we were able to advise on where to source water relative to where communities were out of water, and also the whole process. We sped the process up for getting the formal, let us say, the licensing. We actually had foregone the licensing process because it was an emergency, so that they could immediately start delivering water to communities that were in dire need.
Okay, a couple of things. So based on what you've said there, then Dr. Clark, again, God forbid we have another major hurricane immediately, but NWC at this point, based on what you've said, would be a lot less dependent on JPS and would be able to restore much more quickly. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, I'm not saying that they're less dependent on JPS. The fact is that the system depends on electricity, and copious amounts, large amounts of electricity because there are large pumps in our cases. So it is very hard, for instance, for JPS to go solar with their major systems. What they do have is they now have a bit of resilience built in, that they can bounce back a little quicker and provide, even if it is at a reduced rate, provide water until such time when the power grid is up and able to really meet the power needs that their systems, their water production systems demand.
Okay, understood. And Rick Case, just before I go back to the others, having listened to what you were saying about what JPS has done in the meantime, in particular, changing out some of the, I guess you might call them lighter poles with the composites, the heavier, the denser poles. I know a lot of people would say, okay, why not do that everywhere though? And I know cost is clearly a big factor, but how much were you able to do? And is the plan then to move towards that for everywhere?
Yes, so the plan is to move to this new standard for everywhere. And of course, we have to use the opportunity of whenever we have a pole to be replaced, or we have planned work to replace a pole, to do so. But certainly we wouldn't be able to go for poles that are not yet, that they're perfectly okay to just go and change them out like that.
Okay.
It's very, very expensive.
Okay, is there a timeline though? Because again, Melissa could have hit anywhere. It could have come through Kingston, left everywhere, left
But
all the posts.
So the resilience program that we have is a part of our submission, our tariff submission. So this, of course, will have to go through the regulator process for them to absorb it, and then for us to determine the rates that would allow us to afford it, and the pace at which we can do it at, because we can't do everything at the same time. This might take maybe even 20 years to be able to get to where we want to be. And as well as looking at selective undergrounding as well for certain corridors that we want to make resilient. So we're actually looking at some of those options as well.
All right. Mr. Murad, what's been done in the meantime? What's been done to prepare us for June 1?
Yeah, thanks, Dion. I know we talked on it earlier. I don't think we've actually stopped. There's no preparation anymore. I think for the last 2 years we've just kept going. So all of the work has just carried on. But I think I'll just touch on what we've done since, because I know we talked a bit more on what happened, but certainly let me probably split them into some buckets. Hopefully it'll be easy for everybody to follow me. So on the mobile side, I would have talked at the start, we had 925 towers. That was the original, what we would have had. We've also built incremental ones, and that would be more business as usual for us, Dion. So we're up to 933. Why do we build more towers? We need to increase coverage. That's a pretty straightforward thing that we need. So we've taken the opportunity whilst we're restoring the network, because we have boots on the ground, to accelerate our building of incremental towers. We generally bring incremental towers which are linked to more urbanization. So more concrete and steel structures, higher structures, means we need incremental mobile structures to service the population. So that's more business as usual, but we've accelerated that. We're doing the optimization work. So think of the phases post a natural disaster. So there's you'll go and inspect a tower, see what needs to be done, and then you're sending the troops to go and fix it to get service working. And I use service to a level, not how it was previously. So emergency service working. The optimization work is that final phase where we sweep every single tower, which means we need to climb every single tower to put back the antenna exactly where it was pre the 28th of October. And we have a snapshot of the network every single day, so we know where it should be. So those teams have been sweeping across the country, east to west. Why east to west? It might be obvious, but we're obviously following Rick and Blaine and the team as they restore the network across. We're following them across. We've probably still got about 4 to 6 weeks-ish worth of work of optimizing the network. Why are we behind? I know we touched on it earlier on, apologies, but the weather has really hindered. So it's not safe to climb the lattice towers, the very large towers, when the torrential rain is pouring down. So we obviously have to manage and look after our teams as well. So we're a few weeks behind, unfortunately, on and completing that optimization work. So think of the country just sort of going from Trelawney down through the country in a segment out to Mobay and to Negril, etc. So we're doing that sweep of the country at the moment. They were in the tower when I was in Catherine Hall in Montego Bay. They were up the top of the tower optimizing Catherine Hall's site while I was doing the inspection of where the water came in during the hurricane as well. So doing that optimization work. We're also doing, again, this might seem a little business as usual for us. So we are modernizing the radio access network, which is the antenna. So we are doing that modernization project, which is again part of our business as usual activity as demands come from, Jamaicans' thirst for data never goes backward. It just increases every single year on TikTok or Instagram and Netflix and all of these things. So we have to modernize the network. So we've been replacing and modernizing the radio access network as well. So that'll improve the experience. So optimize and upgrade the mobile network. Then I'll move on to more of the fixed side of the services, which does impact the mobile business. So the transport network that we touched on earlier with Rick on the pulse. So we built our own fiber transport network from Kingston West. So there is a loop around the country with a diverse path as well. Every day there will be incidents. There's not one day that doesn't go by where an incident will happen on a pole. Rick will tell you somebody will unfortunately there'll be an accident, and a pole will be taken down. One was taken down about 5 minutes ago in Montego Bay, which takes down services. Thankfully, the people are all right, and it's a, whilst the car is not all right, but at least the people are all right, and that's the most important thing. But those things happen every day, Dion. So we try to put in some diversity. So if this route goes down, can it fall over to an alternative route? So we took a decision to build our own transport network ring with our partners at JPS, and thanks again to Rick and the team, who did a phenomenal job in recovering. And we worked assiduously to build that fibre ring. That's still aerial or on the pole. But then I moved to my next phase. So we've started to underground some of the core transport network. That's really important for the long-term protection. So we started 2 weeks ago to forgive the phrase, blow the fibres, where they drag the fibre in the duct on the highway. So the Jamaican South Highway has a duct there, an empty duct. So we have an agreement with the China Harbour Company, and that fibre will be under there all the way up to East Orcheria. So we'll have some level of protection underground. Today, that network is aerial. It goes around bog walk, so it's exposed. So that's a significant step, and the first step in to start putting some of the core transport network underground to start a different level of protection. And then I'll probably just touch on the last piece of future protection again. So power is critical. Rick talks about it as well. So we rely on the commercial grid, we rely on generators, and we rely on lithium batteries. Every year, Dion, we incrementally swap out generators. Our generators are generally meant for coverage gaps where there might be a plan works or there's an accident or whatever happens. That might need to run for 6 hours, for argument's sake. Obviously, in Hurricane Beryl and Melissa, they've been having to run for months. So they need to be fueled every 3 to 4 days. They need to be serviced. They will break, and they need to be replaced. So we'll have to do. So we started replacing the ones that are beyond economical repair and adding incremental generators also to the sites as well. Same with the lithium batteries, Dion. We'll add incremental lithium batteries to the site, but the batteries will only cover for like 6 hours. So that's a very interim. And then the last technology, which I know you're going to hand over to Devin next with it, which is a great segue. We partnered with a company called Caban. Caban specialize in solar for mobile site technologies, so they're obviously not a domestic provider at all. They've done a lot of work in Latin America and North America. So we partnered with them. So we're about 100 sites into the project. So obviously they've been mobilizing post the hurricane. So we've started to add another power technology, solar, onto our sites as well. And obviously, Devin made some great points before around, how can we protect to change the angle, or maybe even pack them away, so we're managing that process as well. So I think it's a lot of activities gone on and a lot of activities still going on. So I think we're still in a heightened state of awareness. We actually had our briefing from one of the hurricane experts in the US who did a call with us earlier on to talk about what you just said. But I'll be honest with you, I made the mistake of saying to my wife after Beryl, I think we'll be okay this year, and then all of a sudden I was eating my words repeatedly. So I'm praying that this year is not one of those years I'll eat my words, and we're just prepared, and that's it.
Yeah, Jamaica. I don't know if you know this phrase yet, Stephen, but Jamaicans would say, please don't set your goat bump on us, all right?
If it's any consolation, Christopher Issa, as part of my induction to Jamaica, gave me these 2 books. So a big shout out to Mr. Issa. He looks after me.
Oh, yeah.
I probably know some of the bad words, but not for this program.
Okay, you guys are doing all my work for me, because you're right. That was a great segue to go back to Dr. Gardner to talk about renewables. So having set the stage a little bit earlier in terms of some of what's been happening, hurricane season again coming up, Dr. Gardner, and of course more to come. Tell us if you're satisfied in terms of how you've been seeing the progress towards using renewable technologies that could help to alleviate some of the problems and difficulties we saw after Melissa.
Yeah, well, thanks again. Yeah, and thanks, Stephen, for the statements you made around distributed generation, because I think that is where the success story of Melissa lie, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, Dion, that you know, those who are distributed solar generation, rooftop PV, and that kind of thing, rooftop solar, that was a big benefit. We have seen the prices of batteries going down and the opportunities for batteries to be integrated on the distribution side. Solar is almost dirt cheap nowadays. It's a function of really how you are able to finance it and make it happen. And we believe that you know, it's going to be important that we try to shift some of the focus away from simply looking at centralized generation opportunities and solutions, and look at a lot of the solutions on the distributed generation side. But NWC would benefit a lot from that. You heard Stephen talk about what Digicel is doing, and how they are already benefiting from distribution side solutions. Microgrids as a case in point, solar-based microgrids with batteries and of course, diesel generators as a secondary backup is something that works. In fact, when I was working at the Caribbean, the CARICOM Secretariat, I had done a project with UWI with some grant funding where we had built a microgrid at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab, and that can operate in an islanded function or interconnected to the grid when the grid is indeed available. And that system was able to function 100% after the hurricane, even when at the times when the grid was down. So I think that while we are not yet satisfied with where we are in Jamaica with respect to how fast distributed generation is happening, a lot of it has to do with the rate at which licensing is happening, because of course there's a standard of contracts that are done by the OUR, which is slow down significantly. And I know JPS has its own challenges in terms of making sure that the grid is able to host as much as is wanted and when required. But there's also the issue of financing and how do we financing. And one of the things we believe that can work is to reduce the competition between utility scale solar and distributed side solar by getting the utility involved in the investments on the distributed side, so that the utility is also investing in distributed microgrids, distributed solar in some of your critical infrastructure. If you're talking about microgrids in hospital and so on, there's no reason why JPS shouldn't be making some of those investments and recovering those investments through the rate system. So we have to find creative ways that we can use to be able to attract the kind of investment and the kind of entities with the skills and capabilities to deliver some of those solutions to customers, because the distribution side is really what is going to make the system really resilient.
Let me jump in a little, Dr. Gardner. I want to follow up on that before you move on. First of all, explain for us a little bit more, us non-techie people, exactly what is a microgrid.
Okay, so a microgrid is really a situation where you have pretty much a power generator, which can be solar, with a storage system like batteries, lithium-ion battery storage system. You put in a backup, usually a secondary backup, and you have all your controls. You have your distribution lines that moves the energy from the generator to the building, or the load as we call it, the building that is being served. It could be a hospital, it could be a school, it could be, as we have in the Discovery Bay Marine Lab, that facility. And the energy is moved to the load, whatever equipment is using it, and it uses it just like if it was coming from JPS. There are controls in there that manages how the energy is used and how the energy is moved and how the energy is used, how it is stored and all of that. And you can make it as sophisticated as you want by putting in energy management systems that are sophisticated electronics, and make it pretty simple with switches and switch gear and all of that. So it's really a mini version of JPS, but built for a very specific center.
Well, yes, but that now brings me to my other question, which is a concern I generally have with a lot of what we do, certainly in Jamaica, because you mentioned there a project that you had done while at CARICOM using grant funding at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab. And from what you said, it worked. So yes, we do develop the creative solutions, but we just never seem to scale them. So is that, for instance, is that something that should be scaled?
Something that could and should be scaled, yeah.
Microgrids elsewhere in the country, is that something that would help in another major natural disaster?
Definitely. And there are resources to do some of the scaling. I don't know, how far that more $10 million can go, but I know that there is a grant, not a grant, but there's funding from the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, through the CDB, the Caribbean Development Bank, that is available to JPS and Jamaica to do work on the distributed side in different types of projects of this nature. So, there are resources there. It's really a function of the collective coming together to determine how best to utilize those resources to bring the kinds of solution that could make the system more resilient, because there are the opportunities out there.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. Somebody else wanted to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to comment there because we did do first of its kind, something similar to a microgrid, where I don't know if you remember that we actually powered up Treasure Beach with a mobile generator. We powered up Darliston with a mobile generator, and we also powered up Bethel Town with a mobile generator. And these were basically off-grid solutions because the network was significantly damaged from the source to that particular point. So we put generators in there and fed up to, I think, collectively, it would be close to maybe 3,000 customers between the three, what we call mini islands. So we did that during the restoration in Melissa.
Okay.
Speaking of microgrids.
Sorry, what was that?
Yeah. I was saying, speaking of microgrids, the National Water Commission, they have been actively auditing their systems to determine where it will be opportune, where it will be good for them to go solar, for instance, so that they can have that much more resilience. And let's not forget that we have other players in the water production business. So there's the National Irrigation Commission, and they are producing irrigation water for farmers. And they already have a program of building out microgrids. It's an ongoing program. So it's not a wide scale thing that's happening right across the board, but each year or so, they try, or every other year, they try to bring another one of their systems onto their own microgrid so that they can be more resilient. And the other thing was, you spoke about the matter of the weather and NOAA and what was coming, what the predictions are. NOAA, the Water Resources Authority and the Jamaica Met Service both are under the Ministry of Water, Environment and Climate Change. So we work very closely together. But also equally importantly, we are a part of the World Meteorological Organization. So we recognize that we have to work very closely together. Now, as we see the predictions that are going forward, while the whole matter of named storms and so on, those are based basically on wind velocity, right? But the fact is that all of the storms that are predicted to happen, the 13 or 14, they are expected to be carrying a significant amount of water. So while we consider that, 3 or 4 names, major storms, that's the wind they're talking about. But for all of them, flooding will continue to be a major issue and a major challenge for us to have to deal with. And so that is why we have to be a part of we have to, in our plans, we have to always recognize that we are highly vulnerable to flooding. And so we have to always be figuring out how to be resilient towards that. So for instance, there's flood early warning systems that we can talk about that if you have the time. But the fact is that I just wanted to be absolutely clear that even though we may, if we're so lucky that there are only 3 or 4 major storms and none of them directly hit us, these storms, when they do come, they're so huge that they're carrying so much water that the flood impact will always be a real and clear and present danger.
I think that's such an important point. Thank you so much for making it. I'm going to remind you, Dr. Clark, when you talk, though, keep your hand down for me because you're blocking your face and we want to see your face when you talk, all right? Before we continue, we have a couple of questions in the chat. So before we get too removed from them, let me go to those. I think this one is for JPS. Okay, where did I go? Has a foam technology been used in storm conditions before?
No, we started using them after Melissa, so it's the first time we're using them. However, outside of Jamaica, it's a proven technology. that would have been used in those type of scenarios. But for us in Jamaica, first time.
Okay. And another listener is asking, another viewer is asking, is a long-term plan to have most of the lines underground, or is that not feasible? I think that's for Digicel, but I'd love JPS to take that after as well, because, you know, everybody has been asking, why when I put we line them underground? Why we still talk about pole? But let me go to Digicel first on that.
Thanks, Dion. I think a great question, and certainly is an obvious question. So we've started putting some of the core transport network underground. My only I guess the difference, and Rick can obviously talk about power, and water in particular. So they would need to be much deeper than telecoms. Telecoms probably only needs to be maybe 6 inches underground, micro trenched, but obviously that would not be the case for certainly for power. Definitely, that would not be feasible. But my maybe a longer answer to a shorter question is, apart from yes, we would love to put more core networks underground. Is it how can we do that as a country together? Which is going to take significant investment. And I don't, I certainly, and I'm putting my Jamaican hat on, I think it'd be important for us as a country to not just put the core networks underground, but also to map and tag them that this is where they are to avoid. We had an incident last week where somebody dug on the ground and unpicked all of the fiber network, because we do have some fiber networks on the ground, and it takes down essential services to significant swathes. This one took significant swathes of Kingston. So it needs to be GIS mapped, tagged. So if somebody's going to do some plan works and needs to dig somewhere, that's cool. But check what's there first, or look on a map, which is why I think it's important that digital just can't run solo. That's just not right at all. Whilst we were doing some stuff already, I think that's very important, Dion. So I've had to take a stance that I need to start doing some stuff. But I'm pushing all the time that how do we come as a nation together to do some of those things. But I mean, Rick will probably tell you that that's not a straightforward answer for power at all.
It's not a
Before he comes in, though, is there a time frame you're working with and a target in terms of how much you would want of the line you would want to see under? And
yes, we'll have the highway done by the end of June. So by early July, we'll have up to East Olchie. Will be done.
Okay.
Yeah. I wish we were on that corridor as well. And I think that is kind of where Steve was actually talking. If we had this integrated, I guess you'd say, planning for infrastructure for Jamaica, then we could co-locate and do one investment rollout and take care of a whole lot of different things. So I really wish we had that corridor as well, because we do have circuits running through the gorge as well. And some of those came down during Melissa, some of them came down during Beryl as well. So in terms of what we can afford as a country, I think that the best thing that we could do right now is the selective undergrounding, where it actually makes sense. But to do a wide scale undergrounding of our entire network, I just don't think it's feasible any at all. One, some of the terrain that we have here, it's not uniform, where you could say it's just one size fits all, right? Some of it is going to be much more expensive than where you'd say a viable place, like, for example, New Kingston right here, where it is easier to do, right? So it's going to be a huge, difficult, expensive, disruptive project if we're thinking of just doing it like that. So a phased approach with selective undergrounding, and then you bite off what you can chew over time until you get to a point where you pretty much could achieve everything like what other progressive countries would have done to get their entire system underground. That would probably be the best response, I think.
I think one other call out, sorry to cut you, Dion, that we are working with NWA, and so as we upgrade our road infrastructure, they are going to be putting ducts, but obviously as they upgrade the road infrastructure, so we will also follow the NWA as and when they upgrade the road infrastructure. But obviously that's somebody else, another entity doing some work, and we're following them, as opposed to Digital just digging a micro trench in the road to put in the services. So, but I think that will be important for us to continue doing that program as well.
Okay, and again, understand what you're saying, Eric, in terms of the phased approach, but is there a time horizon at all in terms of want to start, want to put New Kingston under, want to put anything like that? Or is it concept?
We want to start right away. I mean, our 5-year plan that we are proposing to the regulator will have some of these projects in it. And I mean, the Prime Minister, when he met with us during the restoration itself, he had asked us to look at the resilient corridor, which is the Montego Bay area, going all the way from Queens Drive along the Elegant corridor to include the airport, all of those hotels and whatnot. So we actually started looking at it. The engineering designs are, for some of them, are actually in the preliminary stage. We have some preliminary numbers. So those are things that we're actually actively looking at. But to give you a time frame, it all depends on what we're allowed to do within our regulatory window.
Okay, got you. All right, so let me ask this question now, especially as we talk about what else can be done. We're talking about resilience. What does resilience look like in the case of each of your sectors? So, Rick, you've been talking. Let me ask you, we keep hearing about resilient grid. Following Hurricane Melissa, what should that look like, or what could that look like?
So I think resilience for us is going to fall within two main components, right? So resilience typically falls in 3 and /4. So you can either you prevent, you mitigate, you can restore or recover, and then scientists like Peter now will start telling about adaptation, right? Which is learning to live with it. So for us, what we're actually looking at is how we can actually, how do we recover faster? Because we know that these are eventualities. The scale and the size and the strength intensity of these hurricanes are much stronger. They come in with much more water. So how it is that we can recover? So one, the technologies that we're actually deploying now will allow us to break up our grid and restore sections of our grid much faster. So our telecoms network to give us visibility into the network, our redesign of our power grid itself to give us more pathways to the customer is another way that we're actually looking at it. Or what they used to call a smart grid type of infrastructure to allow the grid to do some amount of self-healing. The poles and all of those more resilient structures that I spoke about will help you on the prevent side, but it will not necessarily save you in a situation like Hurricane Melissa. So you want to ensure that you have your stock levels. You want to ensure that you have good contractors. So we're trying to increase the cohort of contractors here in Jamaica with specialized equipment that can get in to basically restore the sections in a faster time. And of course, nothing beyond beats boots on the ground. So you have to have the situation now where you can actually have workers coming in or workers staged here before, so that you have a whole lot of folks, depending on the scale and the size of the hurricane, to respond fast. So how quickly you can assess, how quickly you can respond, and how quickly you can actually restore power is where I think it is. So prevent and restore. We're not yet at the adaptation part. The scientists will be able to tell you how we can actually redesign the grid to coexist with a hurricane. I don't think we're there yet.
Right. Dr. Gardner, what should resilience look like?
Yeah, so I agree with the principle that we're not there yet where we can do full undergrounding. I agree that if the thing about the electric grid and most of the utilities, as you know, is ratepayers pay for it. So we can do anything we want to do as long as there is an agreement that the ratepayers will pay for it, right? Because the investors will invest the money once the regulator makes the determination that the money can be recovered through the rate. So we must always keep that in the back of our mind. No utility is going to do anything that is not going to be recoverable through the rates. So it's always whether or not the ratepayers can afford to pay for the kind of resilience that we want, or what we think the resilience should look like. what resilience should look like in the utility sector, and at least for the power sector, which drives a lot of the other utilities too, is that you're going to have a judicious mix of distributed with centralized system. Have some amounts of, as I mentioned, distributed microgrids serving some of the critical infrastructure like hospitals, some of your major hospitals, your telecoms, some of your major telecom systems, your water treatment and pumping plants, and so on. And you build in the selective undergrounding, as Rick says. And the ICT infrastructure is going to be the most critical piece of a resilient future in terms of a power system, being able to have the kind of ICT overlay that allows the system to be able to identify faults and isolate faults and be able to reroute power from point A to point B in a network which has reduced numbers of reduced single failure points. That's what resilience is going to look at. And then in terms of the transport sector, which is something that we haven't spoken about, the power sector is going to be able to support transport because of the integration between electricity and transport through electric vehicles. And that's something that we need to try to figure out how we can build in some of that available opportunity for including transport or piggybacking from the technologies that integrate electricity with transport. What is the one last point I'll make is that the energy security issues that are stemming from the wars, especially in the Middle East now, is something that is helpful to what we are trying to do with resilience, because it's driving a lot of conversation as it pushes oil prices up towards how it is that we can accelerate some of these solutions so we can shift away from the types of dependencies that we have on the conventional or traditional systems. And so it gives us an opportunity to build in some of those resiliences one time. Thanks.
Okay. Let me just take a second just to remind people, if they've just joined us, that you're watching a panel discussion. It's the second in a National Resilience Dialogue series being put on by the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience. The task force gets made up of our 4 major universities. So Caribbean Maritime University, University of Technology, University of the West Indies, and the Northern Caribbean University. And we're talking today, as I'm sure you figured out by now, utilities, infrastructure, how to strengthen them before the next big hurricane. And let me go to Dr. Clark now, because I know you're with Water Resources Authority. You have been telling us a little bit about what the Water Commission has been doing, though, but especially as we talk about what resilience looks like, I'm especially interested in what you think in relation to the flooding concern you mentioned earlier as well, because it seems as if when it comes to these kinds of events, it's kind of a rinse and repeat for us. It's like every 10 or 20 years, we have a major event, people move out, then they move back, then we flood out again. So what should that look like? And then, of course, if you have anything to add on the NWC issue, feel free.
Okay, Dion, thank you. That's a very good question. Well, with regard to flooding, for instance, what we're finding, of course, is that we have in Jamaica, we're prone to different kinds of floods. Now, the matter of having the silt and sediments and so on, which affect the water supplies. Resilience for us will mean putting in the measures to reduce sedimentation. So it actually means going back to our watersheds. So there will have to be some kind of a program where we'll be looking at our watersheds to rehabilitate them so that there'll be less sediment flow coming down from the mountains into the river courses and then affecting water supply systems. The other thing, of course, is being able to warn people. So while we're not talking about resilience in terms of that, no, we also need to protect people. And the fact is that there are flood warning systems, a few flood warning systems across the island, and they work very well. So for instance, the Bogwalk Gorge, that is a flood early warning system that is triggered by the Water Resources Authority, where when our equipment detects that there is the potential of flooding and for the Rio Cobra to overtop Flatbridge, for instance, then the signal is sent out and it's as a trigger and it goes to ODPEM, and then ODPEM moves it on to the police and to the National Works Agency who own the road, and it moves on to the police and gates are closed. And we have other large areas, towns, for instance, that also have problems. Montego Bay is famous for how it can get flooded out. Port Murray is famous for how it can get flooded out. So we actually have been trying to prepare flood early warning systems for these places. And it's a matter of working with our ministry and working with our funders so that we can build out systems, flood early warning systems. On the other side, um, the the rivers that we're talking about, they're absolutely critical, of course. Um, the pumps for the wells, on the other hand, especially those now, the resilience for the water supply systems will mean putting in as much systems in place that will be using solar power, for instance, so that we can not depend so much on a main grid, or at least have the standby of the even if we do need the main grid, that there is some amount of augmenting, a significant amount of augmenting of the water of the power supply with alternative measures. So those are the things that we have to be looking at going forward.
Okay, and Mr. Moran, for Digicel, what does resilience look like?
I'll just go into two simple terms, Dion. So I think I use the word hardening. So that's about the here and now. So what have we been doing? All the things that I touched on is about hardening or some or protection, so certainly that resilience piece, definitely. So undergrounding the core network we can do, incremental generators, batteries is also critical in that hardening. Solar to the sites also as well. Fibre ring around the island with the diverse paths. So they are classes the hardening pieces which we've been doing. But then I think the resilience piece, and I think Rick touched on this. So thanks for it. It's a good segue for me. Is the people side of it. I couldn't be more proud of the work that my Jamaican team. I'm Bjorn, who's our CTIO. And the team that we have here, we're 1,000 strong workforce, and we have some amazing partners like JPS, Connex, Sectavo, some great fuel distributors as well, like your Petcoms, your Rubis, Petrojam, Johnson's, all of those partners that we have here on island. So we have a huge team, direct and indirect team, and I think they never cease to amaze me, and certainly the rate of recovery to get services working again after one of the most devastating impacts as a country shows the strength and the passion of my Jamaican team, and how impressed I am with them every single day and the work that they did. People might not necessarily know. Rick would tell you. So 5:30 a.m. every single morning, we had a war room with JPS to map out where they're going, and we would follow them all the way around, because that pole infrastructure recovery is critical for what we're doing, and that partnership was critical for that recovery. So I think the people also as well. So a huge thank you also to the Jamaican public, because I know in this modern day and age, not many people are very patient these days. They just want everything to work, and they don't care how it works, but we just want it to work. And certainly in my game, they want their mobile phone to work for their pleasure just as much as their income and their business as well, and just demand it works every single day. And I don't take my job lightly. I know the job that I need to do. I don't sleep. All I think about every single day is how do I make it work better for our customers. So that were my two pieces, Dion, on resilience for us.
Okay, I love you bigging up your team like that. I mean, I'm sure they appreciate it. Here's a question before I continue, and I want to ask about what next we need to do and where we're going from here. But here's a question from a viewer who says, let me see, a couple of questions, in fact. All right, can the transition to renewables be viewed as a resilient strategy, particularly by decentralizing down to impact previously identified vulnerable communities, and asking whether or not this could be seen as an adaptation strategy? Dr. Gardner, I guess that's you.
Yeah, yes, and in fact, that's what the integrated resilience and resource and resilience plan is supposed to do. It's supposed to allow you to be able to identify all different players, not just the utilities, but even the customers and prosumers, those who are customers producing power in their facilities, who would become part of a unified network. Because these days, everybody really is integrated into a single network where there's bidirectional flow of power. So the resilience strategy is one that includes customer integrated into the system from the distribution side, along with those who are on the utility side, generating from the independent power producers, as well as the utility itself, who is managing their way in between. So really, resilience and the resilience feature is one that should be as flexible as possible. And look, and that flexibility will include how it is we are able to integrate as many players as possible into the network in a way that allows different options and scenarios to play out based on what's available at a point in time.
Okay, don't know if anybody wanted to jump in, please do. If not, let me just...
Diana, I probably just want to say something on the renewables, right? So what our lesson from Melissa was that the renewables are not there when you need them, right? So going into the storm, the procedures would require for the renewables to shut down and secure. And then even sometimes days and weeks after the storm, they might not necessarily have been restored. So if we're thinking about the core resilience of being able to restore a grid, and a grid for us is everything from the generator to include the transmission system, the distribution system, all the way down to the customer, right? The reliance on renewables in that particular storm scenario does not necessarily help you in a big way, right? However, resilience at the point of the customer itself, and oftentimes when folks talk about putting in the solar systems and whatnot, it really is at the point at the customer itself to make that customer self-sufficient. So resilience from a self-sufficiency perspective works for that customer, but from a grid perspective, to transport and move power across the network, it will be situational depending on how the grid is configured and whatnot. But to rely on it, I'm not there yet.
Okay, all right. And
One of the things also, Dion, is that, as I told you, the Water Resources Authority works very closely with the Jamaica Met Service. And so we have monitoring systems and monitoring stations across the island. We're monitoring rivers, river flow, river heights and depths and so on, and also groundwater depths. Of course, the Met Service is monitoring, rain and wind and so on. And we do have also rain gauges. And some of our monitoring systems are operating on a real-time basis. The information that's what's happening with our river is coming into the office at the same time that is happening out in the field. Or maybe a 5 minutes, but for all intents and purposes, that's real time. And we've been charged now to continue to work even closer with each other and to develop within ourselves an overall move our systems, a lot of our systems more to real time, to digitize a lot and digitalize a lot more of our operations so that we can make earlier forecasts. Now, this is absolutely critical again in going forward and to protect life and to protect property. That the better we can forecast. And the other thing that we've moved forward with both the Met Service and us is a matter of doing impact-based forecasting. So rather than saying that 8 inches of rain is going to fall, what we need to say and what we have been saying is that 8 inches of rain will fall, yes, but we also know going to say it is going to cause flooding with this river and it is going to cause flooding in that area and the potentials for landslides and so on, all of these things. So impact-based forecasting for the people is a lot more meaningful for them, especially as a threat is imminent and upon them, rather than to just know that winds are going to be 100 miles per hour. What does that mean? Rain is going to be 12 inches of rain in 2 hours. What does that mean? What will be the impact? That's very important, and that's how we move forward.
Okay, we only have 10 minutes to wrap. So we are talking about looking forward, but this viewer question, I think, is a great way to take us into that final segment. This viewer said, in light of both Beryl and Melissa, what would you say is the single biggest weakness in your sector's infrastructure that remains unresolved, and what specific actions are required to address that weakness? And let's start with JPS.
All right, so I think the single biggest weakness for us has very little to do with the infrastructure. I think it has to do with the affordability. As Devon had said, we can pretty much design anything that we want to, but can we really afford it? And as a country, when you look at, for example, a hurricane, how it can wipe out the entire GDP of a particular country. So it's almost like it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of scenario. But it's always one that is heavy to make in terms of the type of investments for resilience, who pays for it, and all of those things. But I think for us, cost recovery is one of the biggest challenges in our particular sector, and having the type of funds available to do the preparation. Some of the things that we're actually looking at now for our recovery includes the parametric insurance facility that is available. Those things will actually help us to at least have some quick cash for part of the recovery. So we're evaluating a few proposals now, and more to come on that. But I think the biggest part in our industry is just the massive cost that comes with devastation and the damned if you do, damned if you don't type of scenario.
Let me just ask you very, very quickly, because as I said, we're fast running out of time. We know we had heard that the JPS grid had been designed for Cat 3.
Yes.
Is that where we are? And if so, are there plans to move to Cat 5 readiness? And if so,
thank you, Dan. So those investments that I spoke about, including using the larger class poles and those things, they are moving us up to a Cat 4. Some of the selective undergrounding, of course, will naturally move us to a Cat 5. But our goal right now is to try to move to the midpoint of a Cat 4 with some of the investments that we're making. The longer term investments in terms of what we're proposing to the regulator now will basically take us on a program of work to keep us there. Beyond that, it's going to require a different conversation and something that we're looking forward to having.
okay. For you, Stephen?
Yeah, so
it's left unresolved and how to resolve it.
yeah, I know the question is probably more pointed down to the hurricane and the let's say the above ground natural disasters. So certainly I think I know that the question was probably more pointed to the underground conversation that we had previously, but I think a bigger risk at the moment, and I know I sort of alluded to, is significant urbanization planning. And to have the telco fixed services as part of the planning infrastructure as we change our urbanization. I guess it was maybe a month or so they talked about moving Black River inland. So what does that look like? Where will the housing developments be? Do I have a tower there today that will support them? If not, where are they going to go? How do we design a network? What happens as when you drive around Kingston, or the surrounding areas, you see more high-rise building. There's no part of the planning process for those that goes, well, where would the network infrastructure go? It's not there at all whatsoever. So that is probably a bigger answer. I know that was not really the question that was being asked, but they are significant things that need to be. Goes back to my point of having a national infrastructure sharing agreement policy process mapped out as and when we move communities, or we build more high-rise buildings to manage more modern population that want more apartment style living than single dwelling. Well, if all of a sudden in that square foot now is 500 people living, and there might have previously been one family living in that, I have to redesign the network in a very different way because of that square footage demand of the pipe, if I can use the word pipe, the internet pipe is very different, and that's significant changes and cost, which would be unbudgeted. So that's probably a bigger challenge that we have as a country of those next leaps forward. You know, places like Singapore, it's core to the urbanization planning. You know, all of the utilities are critical in that urbanization planning, and even before approvals given as well. You're on mute, Dion.
It sounds as if a big part of your answer is the need for this infrastructure sharing policy that you spoke of. I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but as we're recapping, just tell us very briefly or remind us where it is and what needs to happen next for this to come into being.
Yeah, thanks, Dion. So I know that the IFC have been doing some work on behalf of the government in a consultative phase, and they've had feedback from all of the utility companies. So they are looking at how they can advise and build in essence what I'm talking about. You know, from the GIS mapping, where are they? Whether they're on the pole, they're on the ground. So we avoid the challenges that we have, you know, but what does that look like for areas that are underserved? You know, I'm talking as if I'm only talking about served communities, but there are underserved communities also as well. So how can we map that out as a national scheme? And that's not just about broadband, you know, it's about everything. And I think that's critical because, you know, we really need to send ourselves on another level as a country, and I'll be very happy when those things get over the line as well.
Are you Peter Clark?
I'm not sure that I can say that there's a single thing. For instance, Stephen has spoken about the urbanization and the demands that urban growth and urban expansion brings, and of course the challenge of providing water into that space is real. Yes, for instance, for Kingston, let us use something that most of us are aware of. You know, the Kingston has depended on the Hermitage Dam and the Mona Reservoir for a number of years. Next year, the Hermitage Dam is 100 years old. And then we had the Yallas pipeline coming on. There's the program now to build another dam at Hermitage, for instance. So that will be a part of the overall improvement of water supply in the Kingston metropolitan area, in that urban space, and of course bringing water in from content. On the other side, in terms of a single issue, again, and I can speak for the National Water Commission because it's something that is absolutely clear. Right now, they are the largest customer of the Jamaica Public Service. So their one big problem is their dependence on electricity, large amounts of electricity to keep their systems running. So that is a challenge that they will have to look into and see how they can get over that hurdle very quickly. And for us, at the Water Resources Authority, you know, our issue is being able to bring our readings and our measurements into real time, and to make our forecasting and make our analysis be able to happen quicker.
Okay, and Dr. Devon Gardner, you get the final word.
Yes, so my thing would be pre-placement, and I say that because for years we have been talking about how is it we can create an inventory of shared resources that can be moved from areas where where we can store them safely to the areas where they are much needed. Because the truth is, as much as you harden and as much as you build infrastructure that is resilient, there are going to be areas that will take hits, and no matter how resilient they are, they can't stand up to certain categories of hurricanes or weather systems. And being able to pre-place or pre-position some types of emergency equipment for water production or telecoms and power, certainly is, for power in the critical infrastructure, including water and telecoms, is something that we still haven't figured out yet, and I don't think we have done enough work towards that. And FEMA style, like what America does with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that is able to mobilize and pre-position equipment. I know we don't have that kind of money, but even in the instances where we are, collecting money for emergency management, maybe some of those resources that don't go into relief are things that we should look at investing them in. Or we can invest in equipment that allows us to have temporary microgrids or portable microgrids and water production facilities that can be pre-placed. It's something that is a big failure, and it's something that I think we need to address. Thanks.
So many ideas, so many concrete actions being taken. We can absolutely say that we have made progress since Hurricane Melissa, even while we all cross our fingers and toes and everything. I hope we don't get another one. All right. Gonna have to leave it there. Thank you so much to all our fantastic guests this evening. Dr. Peter Clark from the Water Resources Authority, Ricardo Case from JPS, Stephen Murad from Digicel Jamaica, and Dr. Devon Gardner, Regional Energy Specialist and founding partner of the Institute of Innovation and Growth and president of Sunterra Energy. Thank you so much. And this has been the second in the National Dialogue Series put on by the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience. The next in the series comes up on June 4, and make sure you watch out for it. But of course, you can catch up with all of them on the YouTube page. I'm Dion Jackson Miller. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.